Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last call. Please take your seats. Шановні пані та панове, будь ласка, займайте свої місця у залі. Це останнє оголошення перед тим, як ми відновимо роботу конференції. So we are ready to continue. The next session will focus on education facilities. Panel number 4, Distraction of Education Facilities, the Scale and Accountability. The dialogue is moderated by Andrew Carney, head of the European Union Advisory Mission International Crimes Component. Пані та панове, наступна наша дискусія буде присвячена руйнуванню закладів освіти. Панель номер 4 – руйнування закладів освіти, масштаби та відповідальність. Діалог модерує Ендрю Карні, керівник підрозділу консультаційної місії Європейського Союзу з розслідування міжнародних злочинів. Mr. Carney, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this fourth panel of the day. We now move on to the topic of the destruction of educational facilities, the scale and accountability. And so we're going to have 5 panelists who will be addressing you this afternoon. 4 of them are here in person and 1 online. I won't introduce them just yet, but when I come to the questions, I'll give you a short biography so that you understand the background of all of our eminent speakers. So just by way of introduction to this very important topic. So sadly, we see that the attacks against education facilities that form part of a wider scale of attacks against the Ukrainian civilian population that's been relentlessly pursued by Russia, such as against healthcare, energy, agriculture, and all of this with the aim of disrupting the ability of Ukrainians to live their lives, demoralizing the population and, frankly, terrorizing the Ukrainian population. Already numerous schools and other educational facilities have either been destroyed or damaged, with the resultant obvious deaths and injuries, but also the extreme disruption in the learning to pupils and to students. A recent report, in fact, published by the Ministry of Education and Science has indicated that some 3,500 educational institutions or institutes have suffered damage, and that almost 400 of those have been destroyed. The attacks affect schools, universities, kindergartens, orphanages, and specialized education institutions. Not only is it the physical damage to school infrastructure, but also the constant air raid alarms that force children and students out of the classroom and into the shelters. Pupils are fatigued due to the regular nighttime attacks, and power outages disrupt classes and online learning. And one can only guess at what the long-term impact on the mental health of children, teachers, students and pupils is likely to be going forward in terms of their long-term learning. And what are the institutions that have been attacked? What is the scale of the damage, and how is it affecting pupils and students? What progress is being made by the prosecutor's office and law enforcement agencies, in particular SSU and NPU, to ensure full accountability for these attacks against civilians and civilian objects? And what challenges do they face in achieving the difficult tasks? And what are the efforts of international organizations to assist in the investigation and prosecution of attacks on international educational institutions, so for example organizations such as the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group? And what is the judicial perspective on the scale of the destruction? So those are some of the questions that this panel will raise your awareness about in terms of the nature and scale of the attacks and the impact upon Ukrainian civilians. It also aims, the panel, to set out what progress has been made by the investigative agencies, so the National Police of Ukraine, but also the Office of the Prosecutor General, to ensure that these crimes are effectively documented, properly investigated, and that the perpetrators, especially those at the most senior decision-making level, are prosecuted. So, to assist us in getting some of those facts out in the open before you here today, I will now go to the first of the 5 speakers, and that is Mr. Andriy Vitrenko. He is the Deputy Minister of Education and Science for Ukraine. Mr. Vitrenko currently has responsibility over property issues and the reconstruction of educational institutions. He holds a doctorate in economic sciences, is an associate professor at the Department of Economic Theory, Macro and Microeconomics, and is the Deputy Dean for Research and International Collaboration at the Faculty of Economics at the Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev. Mr. Vitrenko is a developer and trainer in training on updating skills of academic and administrative staff in the area of knowledge transfer and the commercialization of university research. So perhaps I can just ask you a very general question, Mr. Vitrenko, to lead you in. But what we want to give is the audience an indication of the scale of the damage and loss that's been caused to educational institutions. And perhaps you could please help us to understand, for example, what has been destroyed and what the educational losses are due to these attacks. What steps are being taken to restore a safe and educational environment? Over to you.
Дякую щиро вдячний за надане мені слово.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. The Ministry of Education and Science think that it's a very important conference that we are participating in. It raises very important issues, and would like to tell you about truly horrendous numbers that we have because of this flagrant Russian aggression, but not only tell you about what we have for today as a result, but also what we do and what we will do in the future. As of today, it's a horrible loss for the educational infrastructure of Ukraine. Every 7th, just think of it, every 7th educational facility in Ukraine is either destroyed to the ground or damaged. And this is not just walls. Each educational facility, it's children. It is children, teachers, professors, people who undertake horrible challenges in their life. It's children that have to study online, children and teachers who either left abroad or changed their life within the country, have moved within the country, or have, after becoming internally displaced persons to become adjusted to the new challenges and new environment. I want also to say that about 1 million of Ukrainian students and school children now study online. And this is a huge challenge not only for them, but for the whole system of education and science in Ukraine. We constantly have surveys thanks to our partners, and as of today, according to the World Bank information, almost $14 billion we need to just restore and reconstruct the infrastructure. The time that it takes, in fact, we don't have it, but these $14 billion need to be, it must be done within upcoming 9 years. However, as I mentioned, it's not about walls, it's not about the walls, it's also about school children who, unfortunately, have to undergo challenges caused by the war. Ukraine took part in the survey, in the global survey, and after this global survey we found out that Ukrainians and Ukrainian boys and girls a little bit fall behind their peers globally, and they a little bit lost their skills and abilities in general. They fall behind by 1.5 or by 2 years from their peers abroad. Moreover, we had a survey of the OECD that showed the call of so-called soft skills of our Ukrainian children, and especially challenges in their psychological and emotional state. What do we do in order to overcome these challenges? As we know, science and education is an element in sustainable development, and the education cannot wait. We cannot deal with it tomorrow. We have to do it today. That's why our main important task is to arrange access to have equal access to safe and quality education, and we are doing it. By we, I mean a huge team of experts. It's the Office of the President, Office of the First Lady, the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, the Ministry of Education and Science, huge number of international partners. I'll not list them, not to forget anyone, or not to leave out anyone, but there is really a myriad of organizations, a plethora of organizations and teachers who have undertaken a huge burden to teach our children during the full-scale invasion and aggression of the Russian Federation. The tasks that the Ministry of Education puts, it's ensuring access to secure and safe education for each school child and each students. It's building shelters, constructing shelters, ensuring gadgets to our children. Restoring education is constant work with donors and partners who invest and who help us restore the infrastructure that we lost. It's also the help to restore the reform of the new Ukrainian school that we started last year and that we are still doing even today. It's not about rebuilding infrastructure, it's about arrangements too, and organizational and structural issues, but the purpose is to bring back the children to schools, to bring them back to face-to-face education, because as we understood it very well, this face-to-face interactions and providing knowledge is the most efficient and ensures the most effective learning process. What we have done already. As of today, we have reconstructed 259 educational facilities, and we have had some renovations, not full, but major renovations in 1,138 educational establishments. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you very much indeed for those words, Mr. Vitrenko. And again, I think it's really important for all the audience here today to understand that it's not, as you said, it's not just about the destruction of the physical buildings themselves, but it's about the destruction of the education system and really the robbing the youth of Ukraine of that education that is so critical for the growth of any country. So thank you very much indeed. So we will now turn to our next speaker, which is more from the accountability side. So Miss Victoria Litvinova is the Deputy Prosecutor General at the Office of the Prosecutor General. Miss Litvinova has spent more than 10 years of experience working in the Prosecutor's Office and was appointed the Deputy Prosecutor General in January of 2023. She coordinates the work in the OPG in the areas of the protection of the interests of children and in combating domestic violence, the Specialised Environment Prosecutor's Office, and in combating human rights violations in the law enforcement and penitentiary spheres, as well as being heavily involved in the work of the Coordination Centre for supporting victims and witnesses. So, Ms. Litvinova, let me ask you this. What is the scale of attacks on educational institutions is recorded by the Prosecutor's Office within the scope of investigations? And what is the legal assessment of these actions?
Thank you, Andrew, for your questions. For the third year in a row, Russia's full-scale aggressions has been depriving our children of the opportunity to study, at their own desk in a familiar classroom. We clearly see that the education system has become another silent victim of Russia's aggressions. This is not accident. Education is an important aspect that can transform a new generation. Russia's deliberate and targeted actions against Ukrainian educational system are aimed at depriving Ukrainian children of the right to education and therefore depriving our country of opportunities for development. Overall, about 20% of all educational institutions in Ukraine have been damaged and destroyed. The shelling of educational institutions, as well as other civilian infrastructure, is prohibited under international humanitarian law. This rule is intended to protect civilians and ensure the safety of educational facilities during armed conflict. Under international humanitarian law, attacks can only be directed at military objects. Educational institutions are not military objects, and shelling them is illegal. We qualify such actions of the Russian military as a war crime. International law recognizes attacks on schools as a serious violations of children's rights in armed conflict. Every time Russian officials try to justify their actions by spreading information that they are attacking only legitimate military targets. I want to give you a few examples of their outright criminal actions. The slide shows a kindergarten in Kiev that was hit by a Russian missile on July 8. On that day, Russians fired 38 missiles at Ukraine. 47 people were killed and about 190 were injured. Inside the destroyed building, children's beds are scattered and glass is everywhere. Fortunately, the children were not injured, as they were evacuated to a shelter in time. The kindergarten was destroyed by 70%. Another example is my hometown of Konstantinivka, Donetsk region, which had 30 preschool and schools. Now there is not even one left. Also on the slide in my home school, where I studied for 11 years, it was destroyed in May 2022. During armed conflict, the right to education under international human rights law operated alongside the international humanitarian law. This means that the parties must make every effort to fulfill the minimum core obligations related to the fulfillment of the right to education. Such conclusions are contained in the annual report of the UN Secretary General, Children in Armed Conflict. The UN Secretary General has emphasized the large-scale destruction of educational infrastructure in Ukraine caused by Russia's full-scale invasions and expressed concern about the serious consequences of limited access to education for Ukrainian children and youth. In 2023, UN Secretary General included the Russian armed forces in the global list of parties that commit grave violations against children in situations of armed conflict. In particular, for killing and maiming of children, as well as attack on schools and hospitals. I would like also to emphasize that children's out-of-school development and education institutions, such as sports schools, children's art centers, libraries, and cultural centers, are also being destroyed and damaged by the shelling. In particular, on March 11, 2022, the Russians dropped 2 aircraft bombs on the century-old building of the Chernihiv Children's Library, an architectural monument. Unfortunately, the building, which survived Second World War, did not survive Russian aggressions in 21st century. I will give an example of the attack in July 2023 on Children's and Youth Sports School in Odessa. In this school, 150 children of various ages, from 6 to 18 age old, took part in international competition and became winners. For example, school student Alina Shapovalova was the world champion in sailing. The ruined complex of buildings was the main methodical base where sailing instructors and experts gathered. Not only the building was destroyed, but also boats, yachts, and motorboats. In addition to the shelling, we have recorded a significant number of cases of the Russian authorities using the educational institutions in the occupied territories for military purposes, which is prohibited by the international humanitarian law. At least 150 cases have been documented and are being investigated. For example, the slide shows the village of Bogdanivka, Kyiv regions, where the Russian military used the kindergarten as an ammunition depot and the school as place of living and rest for Russian soldiers. A mobile crematorium was also located next to the school. The Russian military turned the schoolyard into a parking lot for their military equipment and fuel trucks. Combat vehicles and tanks were stationed close to the school. During their retreat, they blew up these buildings. Now they are destroyed and children have been taken to another village to study. Now I would like to draw your attention to another violation related to educational institutions. Russia used educational institutions as place of illegal detention of civilians. We all do remember the situation happened in March 2022 in the village of Yagidne, Chernihiv region. Russian military detained locals in the basement of a school for a month. During this time, 368 victims, including 69 children, were held in a room of about 200 square meters. The youngest child was 1.5 months old, and the oldest hostage was 93 years old. As a result of this torture, 10 civilians died in the basement of death due to ill treatment conditions and the lack of the medical care. For this crime, 15 Russian soldiers have been identified and sentenced to 20 years in prison. We will continue to gather evidence of international crimes against children and violations of the right to education in Ukraine and work to bring to justice those who planned, organize, implemented, facilitate, and instigate these crimes, both nationally and internationally. Thank you.
Ms. Litvinova, that's very helpful, setting out again, showing us obviously before our eyes the damage done so that everyone can see the scale of the damage. But also you've mentioned the work of the prosecution. So perhaps I could just give you a follow-up question. I mean, how does the prosecutor's office ensure that the perpetrators of these numerous attacks on educational institutions are brought to justice? And is there information on the proceedings regarding the situation, for example, for educational institutions in the occupied territories?
Mm-hmm. The shelling of civilian infrastructure by the Russian military is classified as a war crime under Article 438 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. Each shelling is a completed crime. We registered criminal proceedings for each such fact. Currently, there are more than 2,300 criminal proceedings. The Prosecutor's General Office actively cooperated with the international criminal law, ensure effective investigations and prosecutions of crime related to attacks on educational institutions. Prosecutors ensure the collections of evidence that will be admissible not only in our courts, but also for international authorities. The responsibility for Russian militaries and political leaderships covers not only aspect of criminal liability. We also focus our work on gathering evidence and exchanging information with independent international institutions that provide the independent assessment of Russia's actions. The report of the UN Independent International Commissions on Inquiry in Ukraine recognizes that the targeting and destruction of educational institutions is part of a broader campaign in violence against civilian population of Ukraine, which is contrary to international humanitarian law, which prohibits attack on civilian objects, including educational infrastructure. The Commission called for the perpetrator to be brought to justice and for measures to be taken to ensure that educational institutions are protected from further attack. Expert of the OCSE Moscow mechanism, independent expert who examine cases of destruction and damage to educational facilities have documented numerous cases of war crimes committed by the Russian militaries by deliberately targeting and attacks Ukrainian educational infrastructure, resulting in serious destruction and death of civilians, including children. Such legal assessment by independent international institutions is an element of ensuring the comprehensive responsibility for the Russian Federation for war crimes and grave violations of children's rights committed against young Ukrainians. One of the challenges for prosecutors and the entire criminal justice system in documenting war crimes is the lack of the access to the territory currently temporarily occupied by Russia. Consequently, it is difficult to provide accurate data on damage and destructions of educational institutions. In this regard, the work of independent international institutions is essential to document each violation and collect evidence and data. We have documented other violations by Russia of the norms of the international humanitarian law in ensuring children's right to education. We are talking about the militarization of education taking place in temporarily occupied territories. This is a complex process of introducing military values into the educational process with the aim of making these values a part of ordinary life in a peacetime. The militarization of education in temporarily occupied territories has two aspects. Firstly, this is contrary to international law. Secondly, we are talking about the destructions of the Ukrainian identity of children. This militarization is in fact a political indoctrinational aim at spreading Russia ideology and propaganda. Television broadcast exclusively Russian programs that talk exclusively about the achievement of Russia, politicians and figures. Moreover, military training for service in the Russian army is generally a mandatory part of the curriculum. The destructions of children, Ukrainian identity, and the attacks of school not only violate international humanitarian law, but also pose a serious threat to the development of future generation in our country.
Ms. Litvinova, thank you so much for clarifying that and outlining the critical work that the Prosecution Office and the OPG are doing at the moment in this area. And on the topic of accountability, having heard from you on the prosecution, we'll now turn to our third speaker, who's the head of the National Police, Police General of the third rank, Ivan Vyhivsky. Ivan Vyhivsky has been serving in law enforcement and the National Police for some 25 years. He's worked in various positions, one of those being as the former chief of the Kyiv police during the war, when he organized the activities of law enforcement officers who were active in the defense of the state, evacuated citizens, detected sabotage groups, and countered looters and criminals. Since January 2023, Mr. Vyhivsky has been the head of the National Police of Ukraine, and during this time the NPU has created its units of combatants. It continues to expand and to develop them. The National Police documents and investigates a huge number of war crimes, up to 90%. And so far, he estimates some 126,000 of them under investigation. So, Mr. Verhivsky, if I could ask you this sort of more general question regarding the work of the MPU. Can you please outline to us the work of the MPU has been doing in terms of investigating these attacks and the efforts that the police are making to ensure accountability?
Доброго дня, шановні учасники.
Good afternoon, dear participants to this conference. I'm very grateful to the organizers and to EUM for having invited me to this conference. Indeed, after the full-scale invasion, the scope of powers of the National Police has been expanded dramatically. Alongside the evacuation of civilians, we continued maintaining public order inside of the country. That is what we have been doing over the last 2.5 years. So in addition to our regular duties, we had to deal with some very specific war-related challenges. In the first days of the full-scale war, it was mostly the evacuation. Nowadays, the new functions include participation in combats. So all Ukrainian policemen are now combatants, and there is a dedicated police force unit called Fury, which has taken part in the combats in the east of the country. We contribute to the investigation of war crimes committed by Russian in the Ukrainian territory. For instance, when it comes to shellings of civilian objects, including hospitals and educational facilities, we are among the first to arrive on the crime scene and to document what we see, to document evidence. Alongside military men, military servicemen, policemen help defending our country. And when it comes to education, which is the topic of our panel, of our fourth panel, I have to say that actually each and every citizen who remains in the country, teachers most and foremost contribute to the defense and to the resistance of our country. And all this despite the fact that educational facilities often become object of shelling and missile attacks on behalf of the Russian Federation. I will now speak in more details about what we've documented so far. But before that, let me remind you what was said by the President of Ukraine and by the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. They mentioned almost 140,000 war crimes, 127,000 of them were initiated by the National Police of Ukraine, and the majority of these criminal cases have to do with deliberate, non-discriminative attacks. So not only the National Police records evidence, but also process this evidence in order to make sure that the scope of evidence is sufficient in order to qualify a certain deed as a war crime. There are certain areas which fall within the jurisdiction of the security service of Ukraine. Actually, many war crimes fall within the jurisdiction of the security service. That is why we it often happens that we hand over evidence to the state security service, and I have to say that there is not a hint of competition between the SSU and NPU, because we are not competing, we are doing the same job together, and our joint ultimate goal is to bring to justice those guilty of these terrible crimes. Now speaking more specifically of crimes, shelling. From February 2022, the National Police recorded some 280,000 shellings targeted against civilian infrastructure, which resulted in multiple destructions all over the country. The ammunition being used for these purposes varying from drones, cruised bombs, missiles, etc., etc. We witness civilian objects, including schools, including other educational establishments, being destructed every day, especially in the Kherson region, in the Donetsk region. I think it is understandable that there has been no possibility to restore proper educational process in these regions. The same applies to Sumy region. The idea was actually to have at least one policeman in each educational establishment, so that he or she could somehow ensure security to for the students and the faculty. However, because of the heavy shellings and constant destruction, many of the educational institutions which were intended to resume operation had to postpone this intention. Besides, when it comes to attacks on educational institutions and on other objects, policemen often help identifying victims, injured persons, put in contact injured persons and their relatives who may not be aware of what happened to their close person, or who may not be aware of the whereabouts of a person as a consequence of the attack. According to the data available to the National Police, some 2,509 educational establishments have been either destroyed or heavily damaged all over the country. As of now, the majority being destroyed back in 2022, but unfortunately the trend is still in place, the trend of having educational establishments under attack, especially when it comes to secondary educational establishments such as schools. For example, some 1,600 schools were either destroyed or damaged. The Donetsk region was the most affected by this tragedy alongside Kharkiv region, Chernihiv region, Sumy region. Shelling and bombardment of educational institutions constitute a war crime. And when it comes to the Russian Federation, we can clearly constate that it is their deliberate and intentional pattern of behavior, which is aimed at preventing our children from proper studying, from acquiring proper knowledge, which will, of course, affect their future in longer perspective. So basically, the Russian Federation is depriving our children of the right to education. In order to counteract this negative impact, some measures have been introduced in order to ensure greater safety and security of children in educational establishment, but also in terms of preventing clandestine propaganda aimed at children. You may have heard of cases of putting on fire the vehicles owned by servicemen. So these crimes are committed by children. Many of these crimes are committed by children and teenagers brainwashed by Russian spies, by Russian FSB, the National Security Service, who reach out our children via various messenger and brainwash them and lead them into doing certain things without understanding the consequences. Now, speaking of the measures, security measures that we are thinking of introducing include video surveillance in all schools, fences corresponding to certain construction standards. Besides, we are planning to organize outreach events for students on a regular basis. We equip educational establishments with proper shelters. We apply efforts to detect and bring back children unlawfully removed by Russian, displaced by Russian Federation. We apply efforts to evacuate children from the territories which are close to the front line. Unfortunately, we cannot bring back those deceased and perished. That is why we need to be proactive and to make sure that we are doing everything possible to secure each and every child and to provide children over the country with proper conditions for safe educational process and life in general.
If there's time for a follow-up question at the end, I will ask it for you, but I can see that the time is moving on, and obviously we have two more speakers to go. So I will therefore go to the next speaker, who should be appearing online. It's Ambassador Clint Williamson. Can I just ask, do we have Ambassador Williamson? Ambassador Williamson, are you receiving us from Kyiv?
I am, yes.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Great. Ambassador Clint Williamson is the lead coordinator for the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group, joining us from the US. Very nice to see you. Ambassador Williamson. The ambassador has served throughout his career in a number of senior diplomatic and prosecutorial roles in the US government, the UN and the European Union, including a term as the US Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. In addition to being the lead coordinator, he also serves as the Senior Director for International Justice at Georgetown University in Washington. So straight to a question more from the efforts of from the international sphere of support, Ambassador. Can you talk about the international efforts to assist Ukrainians with investigating and prosecuting these crimes, and particularly the work of the Atrocity Crimes Advisory Group?
Thanks, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with the other participants on this panel. Sorry I'm not able to join you there in person this time, but I'm glad to be able to join from Washington and to speak in this latest iteration of the United for Justice conference series. As we look at attacks on educational facilities, I'm certainly mindful of my visit in June 2022 to the village of Bogdanivka, which a place that Victoria mentioned just a few moments ago. ACA had been working from Poland with the OPG since a week after the full-scale invasion. But we shifted our operations back to Kyiv in May of 2022. And a couple of weeks later, I had the opportunity to go for the first time with the then Prosecutor General to an area that had been liberated from Russian occupation. Russian troops had occupied Bogdanivka on March 8, 2022, and held it until it was liberated by Ukrainian forces over a month later. During this time, as Victoria indicated, the Russians commandeered the village school as their headquarters and housed soldiers in the building. It was the base from which they engaged in a campaign of looting, torture, rape, and murder of the village's residents, transforming a place that had been the pride of the village into a locus of terror. When the Russians fled Bogdanivka, they focused their rage on two buildings: the school in which they had been based, which they burned using books from the library as fuel for the fire. Imagine that. And the village kindergarten, which they blew up. When I saw it, only one wall remained of that building. For what reason? None, but spite and terrorization. So in what, as I said, was my first visit to a town that had been occupied, I saw firsthand the effects of educational facilities being intentionally targeted. The consequences this had for this small community. I spoke with investigators and prosecutors who are continuing to gather evidence of the crimes committed there. But I also had the opportunity to speak with residents of the village who tellingly spoke of the devastating impacts on their children, on the very soul of their community. And clearly that's what the Russian occupiers intended, to strike at the heart of the village by first desecrating the school by their presence and then destroying it, seeking to hit the community through the children, the most vulnerable of its residents. When you multiply these effects out across Ukraine in cities, towns, and villages that have been occupied by Russian forces, and even those more distant from the front lines, where educational facilities have been targeted by shelling or missile attacks, you can see that the impact is much greater than just damaged or destroyed building. It's going after the lifeblood of these places. You've heard the statistics on how many schools and other educational facilities have been targeted, so I won't repeat those. But it underscores how widespread this has been and reinforces the point that it is not accidental. As far as ACA is concerned, we want to be as supportive as we can of the OPG's efforts and those of other Ukrainian government institutions in investigating and prosecuting those responsible for these crimes. Since I don't think ACA has been discussed in great detail here today, I wanted to just give you a little bit of background about who we are and what we do. In short, ACA is a joint initiative of the US, EU, and UK governments to provide ongoing assistance to the OPG in its investigation and prosecution of atrocity crimes. We all recognize that although the ICC is deeply invested in prosecutions of crimes in Ukraine, its institutional constraints will limit it to handling a small number of cases. Very significant, high-level cases, such as those against Vladimir Putin, but nevertheless a small number. So the vast majority of war crimes cases will fall to the domestic authorities to handle. And this will be a huge burden on the Ukrainian justice system for years to come. So what ACA is trying to do is lend expertise in the handling of atrocity crimes cases to our colleagues in OPG. Ukrainian prosecutors are very capable, and this is a highly developed prosecutorial system with which we're working. These prosecutors know how to conduct investigations and put together viable cases for prosecution. But where they do need assistance is in incorporating the very specialized approaches particular to atrocity crimes cases. And this is the void ACA seeks to fill. We're drawing on very experienced prosecutors, investigators, and analysts who have spent years handling these types of cases in international criminal tribunals or in domestic systems like Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, where atrocity crimes have featured prominently in recent years. We're working hand in hand with our Ukrainian counterparts, bringing our experience to bear and offering our insights and advice. But it's important to note that our work is solely advisory in nature. We don't have executive authorities to conduct investigations or prosecute cases in court. Those authorities rest solely with the OPG and Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. But we are prepared to do anything we can to enhance the work that they're doing and help ensure that the cases they're bringing forward are as strong as possible and consistent with the highest international standards. So just to close, in this particular area where we're talking about attacks on educational facilities, the expertise we bring from our experience in international tribunals in places like Croatia and Bosnia can be incredibly helpful. The analytical techniques necessary to determine origin of fire, develop chain of command, ascertain location of units and personnel in a given place at a given time, understanding protocols governing Russian military actions, and so on. All of these capabilities exist in Ukrainian government institutions. But where we're able to help is in bridging the gap between those skills and prosecutorial functions. In other words, helping organize these capabilities and tap into our experience for incorporating this information and these processes into criminal prosecutions for atrocity crimes. This is not in any way saying that Ukraine is deficient in their capabilities, far from it. But the fact is that no domestic prosecutorial service in the world, no matter how advanced, has these skill sets in-house unless they're one of those few unfortunate countries that has had to deal with widespread atrocity crimes. So what ACA is doing is tapping into that expertise from such countries and from international tribunals and deploying that in Ukraine. Where we are talking about prosecution for attacks on civilian targets, and in this specific instance of attacks on educational facilities, these capabilities will be critical for developing viable cases for prosecution, and the ACA-OPG partnership is focused on accomplishing just that.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for indicating to our audience the work of ACA, and in particular regarding this particular area. So moving to our fifth speaker, Sir Howard Morrison, KC, who is the UK's independent advisor to the Prosecutor General. Sir Howard has had a long and distinguished career working domestically in the UK as a barrister and thereafter as a circuit judge in England. And thereafter on the international scene, where he has served firstly as defence counsel at various international tribunals, so at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, also for the Special Tribunal Lebanon, before serving as a judge at the ICTY from 2009, where he was one of the trial judges on the Radovan Karadzic case. And more recently, he served up until 2021 as a judge at the International Criminal Court. So Howard, from a judicial perspective, could you give your opinion on the scale of the destruction of educational facilities?
Well, I mean, the word, it's shocking. It's much more widespread than I had imagined or I had learned to date. I knew it was happening, but these figures which have been put out really show the extent and depth of the problem. In my experience, war crimes nearly always have a subtext. And the subtext with these attacks are the destruction, not simply of the physical buildings, not simply putting the lives of people at danger, some unhappily being killed, others being wounded, which is probably at the pinnacle of the shocking nature of it. But close behind is this subtext that it's an attack on the fabric of society. It's an attack at a local level, it's an attack at the national level, it can even be an attack at the international level, where that crime is aimed at destroying the identity of a nation, which is what the Russians have said they're trying to do. So this is, like attacks on hospitals, attacks on educational establishments are right up there at the top of the most serious of war crimes. And if they came to court and there was a conviction, the sentences that would be passed are the top of the scale, because these are dreadful attacks, and it's something we can all relate to. Unlike perhaps an attack on a military base, we can all think, everybody in this room has been a student. Everybody's been to school. Most people have been to university. Many people have children who've been to school or are at school or are at university. It's part of the depth of our human experience and the fabric of our lives and the fabric of our society. And when you seek to destroy that, you are doing something which is particularly evil. And just imagine, throw your minds back to when you were at school or at university. Imagine you're sitting in a classroom or a lecture room and a drone comes through the window, or through the window of the room next door. There is a massive explosion. You're thrown to the ground. You're deafened. If you're not further injured, you're in a state of terrible confusion. And that facility that you've put your faith in for your future or your children's future has gone. It may or may not be replaced. But that experience will never leave you, and it will never leave the children. And that's why it's such an evil and damaging thing to do. And that's why all the efforts which are being made nationally in Ukraine and with international assistance are so important to try to bring the perpetrators of this level of evil, and I don't shy away from that word, to justice. It's not simply a criminal offense, it's a moral outrage. And you've got to look at war crimes quite often as a moral outrage, where you deliberately set about destroying not only people's property and lives, but the fabric of the society and the future of the society in which they live. And that's what makes it so egregious, so dangerous, and why we need to be doing everything we can to assist the Ukrainian people, not only to have accountability for these actions, but to do everything possible to stop it happening in the future and put it to an end. That's a big ask. I have no doubt that the Ukrainian people are spiritually, morally capable of doing it, but like everybody, we all need help. And it's a matter for the international community to recognize, through listening to the sort of things I've listened to today, it's a matter for the international community to say, enough is enough. This has to stop. We have to be part of the solution. We mustn't be part of the problem. Thank you.
Sir Howard Morrison, thank you very much indeed for those words. So I'm looking at the time. I note that we are a minute or two before the end. I've been told that we have to finish on pain of me being deported from Ukraine. So I was hoping to ask Ambassador Williamson and also Police General Vyhivsky another supplementary question, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. But I think you'll agree that the amount of work that's gone into researching this particular area, to be able to explain it to you, to be able to help you understand the depth of the work that's being undertaken at the moment, the scale of the problem, is really very high indeed. And so I thank all of our colleagues from the Ministry of Education, from the OPG, from the National Police, and Ambassador Williamson from ACCA, and Sir Howard Morrison for being here today. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, distinguished panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay in your seat because we are continuing right now. There is our next topic is no less important and complicated than previous. Combating illicit sale of technologies to Russia. Please welcome the panelist and moderator Władysław Lesiuk, advisor of the head of the Office of President of Ukraine. Подякуємо всім учасникам попередньої конференції. Наша наступна тема не менш складна і точно не менш важлива. Пов'язана з законом про технології до Офіс. Запрошуємо на саме учасників цієї панелі і модератора Владислава Лесюка, радника керівника Офісу Президента України. Пані Панове, залишайтесь на своїх місцях. Ми продовжуємо.
Please remain seated. We will continue in a minute.